Night had fallen over the Pacific island chain, the sea beneath them black and still under the moon's pale glow. Around 3 o'clock in the morning, on a clear spring day in 1945, the pilots of the P-51D Mustang slipped their chocks and throttled their engines, the low hum of Merlin power vibrating through the air. For the Japanese pilots on emergency alert, the air defense nets had grown silent. They were accustomed to the routine of intercepting enemy bombers, patrolling the skies, holding the tide at bay. But this time things felt different. Something they never expected was coming. In the briefing room earlier, a young Japanese aviator, let's call him Lieutenant Sato, had stared at the map and listened to intelligence officers whisper of single-engine American fighters seen far from their usual bases. Japanese high command had assured him such penetration was impossible. The range limitations of American fighters, they believed, rendered deep strikes improbable. But now, radar pings showed silver dots climbing at altitude. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. At 10,000 feet, the Mustangs appeared, crisp in formation, wing to wing, engines humming as though alive with menace. Lieutenant Sato and his fellow pilots looked skyward and saw the sleek, polished aluminium fuselages, bubble canopies glinting in the moonlight, long-range drop tanks hanging under the wings. For the first time, the Japanese pilots recognized that the Americans had reached their home skies. The inviolable sanctuary of the home islands seemed suddenly vulnerable. Sato climbed in his Mitsubishi A6M0, his heart pounding with a mixture of fear and adrenaline. He had flown many sorties, but this felt different. The wind was colder at altitude, each breath via oxygen mask sharp and quick. His radio crackled with orders: scramble, intercept, protect. He flicked on his canopy heater and braced himself for what lay ahead. He recalled the expectation drilled into him: we will push them back. But as he banked and pointed his Zero toward the rumored invaders, he sensed uncertainty. Then the first Mustang appeared overhead above him. Lieutenant Sato looked up and saw a polished silver wingtip, thought he must be imagining it. The aircraft suddenly dove, and in the dive it picked up terrifying speed. A blur of metal hurtled earthward. The Mustang completed its dive and then climbed away, leaving the Zero behind. Sato's gut clenched. This was something he had trained against in theory, but never believed he would face in practice. The Americans had weaponized a combination of technology and range to break the barrier. In later debriefs, the American pilots would note that the P-51D, fitted with the Packard-built Merlin engine and long-range drop tanks, could approach top speeds of about 437 miles per hour in level flight, though in a dive, the speeds exceeded that threshold. WW2 Aircraft Forums +3 National Museum, AF Mill +3, Simple Flying +3, the Japanese pilots, more accustomed to turning fights and relying on agility, now faced an aircraft whose advantage lay not in turn radius, but in diving energy and raw speed. And so the message came. Crackling over Japanese radio waves, it ordered the simplest but most profound tactical shift: avoid pursuit combat. They had glimpsed their old methods becoming obsolete. The new rule of engagement was being forced on them. Pursuit, chase after a retreating enemy into a dive once seen as bold and aggressive, was now too dangerous, too disadvantageous. Instead, they would hold altitude, choose their moment, avoid being drawn into a trap of speed and zoom climb. Lieutenant Sato felt the weight of this change as he pulled back from his control stick and climbed again, watching the Mustangs streak past high above, then dive, strike and vanish before he could gain a firm firing solution. In his headset came the voices of his comrades: frustration, shock, confusion. The sky had changed, and they were learning the new laws of it in real time. He banked, climbed to a higher altitude, kept his eyes peeled for glinting wings, but the Mustangs rarely offered a turning fight. Instead, they dictated the terms. They dived, they zoomed, they disengaged. Sato remembered when a Mustang dove past his formation, and he pushed his Zero into a chase. The controls stiffened as his speed built, his plane shuddered under the strain, and yet the Mustang simply vanished into the clouds above. When he finally pulled up and regained eyes on the skyward horizon, the Mustang reappeared above him, reversed direction and closed in from high altitude, firing a short burst, then climbing away again. Sato banked hard and evasively, his Zero trembling with the effort. He radioed in, voice tight. "We cannot chase them, dive speed too high, avoid pursuit." The words echoed across the cockpit and across his mind, over and over. On the ground in Japanese command centers, the commanders watched the radar reports and the pilot transmissions. Their fighters had always excelled in low-altitude interception and turning combat. But here was an opponent that refused to play by those rules. The Mustangs brought a combination of range, speed, and dive capability that made traditional pursuit tactics not only ineffective but dangerous. The home island defense doctrine was shifting beneath their feet. Lieutenant Sato and his comrades were now forced into a defensive posture, into tactics of surprise, altitude advantage, and disengage rather than pursuit. They flew fewer sorties, climbed higher before engagement, waited in ambush rather than hunted. They still fought, still risked everything, but the rules had changed. Sato returned to base one evening, his plane bearing, having fresh scratches and scars, his mind heavy. He shut down the engine and climbed out of the cockpit into the humid island air. He removed his helmet and wiped sweat from his brow. He looked at his fellow pilots, young men, many of them, some barely 20, whose faces carried the same mixture of fear and resolve. He thought of the old days, when the sky felt spacious and their Zeros felt fast and lethal. Now the sky felt different, expansive, dominated by unseen threats, controlled by the enemy's new airborne energy. He sat down on a crate near the hangar and listened to the distant thrum of Mustangs taking off, ready for yet another mission. The wind carried the faint smell of fuel and oil, and he closed his eyes for a moment, trying to steady his breathing. He whispered to himself, "Avoid pursuit combat." In the next sorties they adopted the new tactics: climb to altitude, hold position, wait for the enemy to dive. From above they would pounce briefly, then break away. They no longer chased the invaders into the clouds. On one occasion, Sato and his wingman climbed to 15,000 feet and spotted Mustangs forming up for a strike. The Japanese pair held their altitude, let the Mustangs pass overhead, then dived in from above. The sudden surprise burst of fire caught the American wingman off guard, forced a break, but the Mustangs simply zoomed away and disengaged. Sato realized that though they could still inflict damage, the dominance of the Mustang in speed and energy made it impossible to impose the fight on terms favorable to the Japanese. The phrase echoed in his head, "Avoid pursuit combat." As the weeks passed, Sato's squadron flew fewer bold intercepts and more cautious patrols. The psychological edge had shifted. The enemy, once the pursuer, had become the master of engagements. The Japanese pilots still fought valiantly, still defended their islands with skill and courage, but they did so under new conditions. They were being forced to fight by the enemy's rules. The Mustang had turned the tables. Its maximum speed of approximately 437 miles per hour at high altitude gave it a decisive advantage. National Museum. AF. Mil +1 Sato thought of his Zero, its graceful lines, its incredible agility. He loved it still, but he understood now that turning fights were no longer enough. He needed altitude, speed, surprise, and above all, the sense not to chase. Finally, on a still dawn in August 1945, Sato flew his last sortie. The war was nearing its end. The skies above the islands were quieter, though the risk remained. He climbed into his Zero, scanned the horizon one last time, and thought back to that moment when the Mustang first dove past him, that polished silver wing tip disappearing into the clouds. He thought of the radio message, "Avoid pursuit combat." He thought of his comrades still flying, still fighting. He knew the war was changing. He knew the air war had been lost. He landed, shut down his engine, and climbed from the cockpit. He removed his gloves, unstrapped his helmet, and looked up at the sky. The engine noise faded, the wind whispered through the hangar rafters, and he felt something settle inside him. The rules of the sky had changed irrevocably. As years passed, Sato would reflect on that moment in time. He would remember how the Mustang's dive speed, its energy advantage, and the message "avoid pursuit combat" represented more than a tactic, they represented a turning point. He would think of the thousands of hours flown, the sacrifice of pilots, the roar of engines, the flash of guns, and the silent shift beneath the clouds. He would stand later, perhaps on a quiet tarmac, watching a restored Mustang fly overhead, polished aluminium glinting in the sun, and he would remember the radio crackle, the dive, the fear and the lesson learned. Avoid pursuit combat. And for those who heard that message, the battle in the skies was already lost. Under the growing light of dawn, the Pacific sky shimmered in faint gold as Lieutenant Sato and his comrades prepared their aircraft for another day's patrol. The airfield was quiet except for the rumble of engines warming in the distance and the muted shuffle of mechanics checking the Zero fighters one last time. For decades, the Japanese fighter doctrine had been built around a single, unshakable principle: agility. Their planes were designed to turn tighter, react quicker, and slip into the enemy's blind spot with the grace of a falcon. The Mitsubishi A6M0 embodied this philosophy perfectly: light, responsive, and deadly in close quarters. It could twist through the air with such precision that, for the early years of the war, Allied pilots spoke of it with awe and dread. But time was a cruel opponent. By the spring of 1945, the rules that had once governed the sky were collapsing. The enemy had brought something new, faster, stronger, and altogether different. The P-51 Mustang was not a product of instinct or tradition, but of engineering and evolution. Its laminar flow wing sliced through the air with minimal drag, its fuselage streamlined to perfection, and its Merlin engine capable of immense power even at high altitude. American engineers had paired brilliance with practicality, giving it drop tanks for range and strength enough to dive beyond the limits of most aircraft of its day. Where the Zero thrived in a horizontal turn, the Mustang ruled in the vertical dive, zoom, and climb again before the enemy could react. It was, in essence, a machine built for energy warfare. When Japanese commanders learned of its performance, disbelief gave way to alarm. Reports from the front described Mustangs achieving speeds over 400 miles per hour and diving past 430 without losing control. No Japanese aircraft could match that combination of power and stability. Sato listened as his commanding officer stood before the pilots, the morning sun casting long shadows across the wooden floor of the briefing room. The message was short and heavy with consequence. "Do not engage in pursuit combat," the officer said. "Do not chase them down. Let them dive past you, then brake and use altitude or surprise. The Mustang is faster in the dive. To follow is to die." The words landed like stones in Sato's stomach. This was a reversal of everything he had been taught since flight school. Pursuit had always been a mark of courage. The pilot who chased his enemy down was the one who earned honor and victory. But now, pursuit was forbidden. That afternoon, the squadron launched into a humid blue sky streaked with cloud. Sato flew second in formation, his wingman on his right, both climbing steadily toward 15,000 feet. Below them, the ocean glimmered, dotted with sunlight like shards of glass. They were to intercept an American formation reported near the coast. As they climbed, the radio buzzed with coded chatter, fragments of information from spotters and radar. Silver aircraft, high altitude, moving fast. Sato adjusted his throttle and scanned the horizon. Within minutes he saw them, bright specks reflecting sunlight, moving in perfect order. The Mustangs. The silver birds came in high, dove steeply, and strafed the ground targets with ruthless precision before zooming away. Sato banked sharply and pushed his throttle forward. His Zero quivered as it accelerated into a dive, the roar of wind filling his cockpit. For a moment he felt the familiar thrill of the chase, but it was short-lived. The Mustang ahead seemed to stretch away effortlessly, shrinking in his windscreen like a ghost fading into the horizon. He dived harder, his airspeed climbing, his hands tight on the stick, but then came the vibration. The controls grew stiff, the airframe trembled. He realized he was reaching the structural limits of his plane. If he pushed further, the wings might fail. He pulled back slightly, losing speed, and in that instant the Mustang vanished into the cloud layer below. When Sato regained control and leveled off, he scanned the sky, searching for the glint of sunlight on aluminium. The radio crackled again. "Enemy reversing course. Above you." He looked up just in time to see the same Mustang diving from higher altitude, its guns flashing. Tracers streaked past his canopy. He yanked the stick and rolled sharply left, the Zero groaning in protest. The American fired a burst, missed, then pulled away with stunning ease. Sato exhaled shakily, his heart pounded in his chest. Never before had he felt so powerless in the air. The advantage of the enemy was obvious and absolute. He keyed his radio. "Mustang diving at impossible speed. This is not a fight we can win in normal pursuit combat." There was a pause, then the calm voice of ground command replied, "Understood. Avoid pursuit. Conserve energy. Use altitude. Use surprise." The words echoed hollowly through his headset. He repeated them quietly to himself, as though testing their meaning. Avoid pursuit. Avoid pursuit. It felt wrong, unnatural, but it was survival. As the day wore on, Sato flew 2 more sorties. Each time the pattern repeated. Mustangs attacked from altitude, made 1 swift pass, and disappeared. The Japanese fighters tried to chase, but none could keep up. Their Zeros, designed for agility and lightness, simply lacked the dive strength to maintain control at those speeds. Even when they managed to force brief turning engagements, the Americans would use their power advantage to climb vertically and reset the fight. The Mustang dictated every engagement, deciding when to attack and when to escape. The Japanese pilots, once the hunters of the sky, now found themselves adapting to defensive tactics, striking only when surprise allowed and retreating before the enemy could retaliate. That night, in the barracks, Sato sat by the dim light of a kerosene lamp, his flight log open before him. He wrote mechanically, recording the day's encounters. Altitude, bearing, enemy type, ammunition spent. But his mind kept returning to the same thought: the sky had changed. The old rules, the sacred teachings of his instructors, no longer guaranteed survival. He remembered one of them saying long ago, "The pilot who controls the turn controls the battle." Now, he thought bitterly, it was the pilot who controlled the dive. In another corner of the world, American pilots were celebrating their success. The Mustang was proving itself not just as an escort for bombers, but as the definitive weapon of air superiority. It could fly farther, fight longer, and strike deeper than any Allied fighter before it. Pilots praised its reliability and power. It was fast enough to outrun danger, yet stable enough to escort heavy bombers all the way to their targets and back. For them, each mission reaffirmed the design's genius. The Mustang was not merely a fighter, it was a statement of dominance. For Sato and his comrades, that dominance was a daily reminder of how the war was turning. The Japanese pilots had once believed their homeland untouchable, their tactics supreme. Now, they flew under a sky ruled by speed and energy, by an enemy that could dictate the very rhythm of combat. Each radio message that came back from command carried the same phrase, "Avoid pursuit combat." It was no longer simply an instruction, it was an admission. The era of the chase was over. Sato stood outside his barracks that evening, looking toward the western horizon where the sun bled into the sea. The air smelled faintly of fuel and salt. In the distance, he could hear the rumble of departing aircraft, perhaps Mustangs, perhaps their own. The war had become a contest not of courage, but of adaptation. He understood that now. As the wind brushed past his face, he whispered softly, almost as a prayer, Avoid pursuit combat. The words no longer felt shameful. They felt necessary. The new rules of the sky were cruel, but they were real. And in that vast expanse above, filled with thunder and fire, only those who accepted them would survive. That night, sleep came slowly. Sato dreamed of flying again, the Mustang streaking past like a comet, the Zero twisting helplessly in its wake. When he awoke, the first light of dawn filtered through the shutters. Another day, another mission awaited. He rose, fastened his flight jacket, and stepped outside. The sky overhead was endless, pale blue and silent. Somewhere up there, the new masters of the air waited. He took a breath and nodded to himself. The world had changed, the sky had changed, and so must he. The morning broke over the Pacific with a deceptive calm, the horizon glowing faintly in shades of rose and gold. It was April 7th, 1945. The date would be remembered not for victory or triumph, but for revelation, the day when the very laws of aerial combat seemed to change before Lieutenant Sato's eyes. On the airstrip in Kyushu, the Japanese ground crews moved briskly, tightening bolts, refueling tanks, and checking weapons in the grey light of dawn. In the distance, the low rumble of engines began to rise like a gathering storm. A formation of American B-29's Superfortress bombers was reported approaching from the southeast, escorted by the now-feared P-51 Mustangs. The air was thick with tension as pilots strapped into their cockpits. Sato adjusted his harness, his hands steady though his pulse hammered beneath his flight suit. He looked down the line of Mitsubishi Zero fighters, their white paint gleaming faintly under the early sun, their rising sun insignias bright against the metal. These aircraft had once been the pride of Japan, the unmatched symbols of agility and grace. But this morning, they would meet a different kind of enemy, one not bound by the same rules of turning combat that had defined the early years of the war. "Scramble! Scramble! Enemy fighters inbound at 13,000 feet. The order crackled through the base loudspeakers, slicing through the stillness. Sato pushed the throttle forward, the engine roaring to life as his Zero lurched down the runway. The wheels lifted from the ground, and in seconds he was climbing into a boundless expanse of blue. The radio buzzed with voices, call signs, coordinates, warnings. Above the waves, he saw it, a glint of silver far to the east, growing brighter, larger. The Mustangs were coming. As they closed the distance, the sky transformed into a ballet of light and death. Silver shapes streaked through the morning air, the Mustangs escorting bombers, whose massive shadows crawled across the sea below. Sato's heart pounded as his formation spread wide. He could see the enemy fighters jettisoning their long-range drop tanks, the metal canisters, tumbling toward the ocean like falling stars. Then came the flash of tracer fire. The Mustangs dove. The first pass was devastating. The Americans came screaming down from altitude, guns blazing, their dives impossibly fast. A fellow pilot shouted over the radio, "They're above us, too fast to intercept." Sato rolled hard left, narrowly avoiding a burst that tore through the air where he had been moments earlier. He turned sharply, lining up on a Mustang that had broken formation. For a heartbeat, the enemy filled his gun sight. But before he could fire, the Mustang accelerated a sudden, impossible burst of speed and vanished below. He dove to follow, his Zero shuddering as the air resistance grew fierce. The altimeter spun. The wind roared so loud it became a scream. The stick stiffened under his hands. He was near the edge of his aircraft's tolerance. And still, the Mustang below him was gaining distance. The Zero's wings began to tremble, the control surfaces fighting against his grip. He pulled up sharply, heart hammering, the sky twisting in his vision. When he leveled out, the American fighter was gone, not destroyed, not even damaged, simply gone, as if the wind itself had swallowed it whole. Sato's breathing was ragged. He keyed the microphone. "We cannot chase them. Their dive speed is beyond our limits. We must avoid pursuit." Static hissed in reply, followed by the calm voice of his squadron leader. "Acknowledged. Climb. Use altitude advantage. Strike only once, then disengage." The words stung his pride. Avoid pursuit, the same warning he had heard in training briefings over and over these past weeks. Still, hearing it now, in the middle of battle, stripped away any remaining illusion of equality. The Japanese pilots could no longer fight on their own terms. Sato climbed again, the Zero's engine straining. The world below seemed distant, unreal clouds like islands, the faint curve of the sea far beneath. He steadied himself, scanning the horizon. Then, movement another Mustang, diving past a bomber formation. Its guns flashed, and one of the bombers below burst into smoke. Without hesitation, Sato turned hard and dove. The Mustang's silver fuselage filled his view. He gritted his teeth and pressed down the throttle, feeling the acceleration pull against his chest. But again, the same cursed speed. The controls began to resist, the stick heavy, the airframe groaning as though protesting the strain. His gun sight wavered. He had lost the target. Then, from above, the sunlight blinked a flash of metal. Another Mustang was diving straight at him from higher altitude. He was caught in the open. The tracer round zipped past, and instinct took over. He rolled, broke off the dive, and climbed sharply into the clouds. His engine coughed under the sudden strain but held. He broke through the white mist, emerging into the cold blue stillness above the cloud layer. For a moment, silence. He was alone. Sato took a deep breath, his gloved hand trembling slightly on the control stick. He knew what had just happened. He had been drawn into a trap. The Mustang below had baited him into diving, bleeding his speed and altitude, only for another to strike from above. It was a tactic that exploited everything the Americans knew about the limitations of the Zero, and it worked flawlessly. Below, the battle raged on. The American bombers pressed westward toward Japan, their engines a steady rumble across the sky. The Mustangs wove between them like silver guardians, diving to strike, then climbing effortlessly back into position. Japanese fighters darted in and out, brave but outmatched, their attacks scattered and fleeting. The Zeros that tried to chase often found themselves overspeeding, losing control, or being ambushed from above. The energy advantage speed gained and retained through the dive and climb belonged entirely to the Americans. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. By mid-morning, the radio channels were a mixture of chaos and resignation. "I cannot hold altitude," one pilot shouted. "They're faster than anything we have." Another called, "Climb! Don't chase! Stay high!" The doctrine that had once shaped Japanese aerial warfare, the art of the turn fight, the reliance on finesse was crumbling before their eyes. The Mustangs had rewritten the rulebook. When Sato finally returned to base, the once clear morning sky was streaked with trails of smoke and contrails. He landed hard, the wheels bouncing against the rough strip. His ground crew rushed toward him, but he waved them off. Stepping down from the cockpit, he looked out toward the horizon. The air smelled of oil and gunpowder. The sea beyond shimmered peacefully, a cruel contrast to the destruction above it only hours earlier. Inside the debriefing hut, the mood was heavy. One pilot sat with his head in his hands, another stared silently at the floor. The commanding officer entered, his voice low but firm. "You all fought with honor," he began. "But you saw it yourselves. The enemy has greater speed, greater reach. Pursuit is no longer an option. We adapt or we perish." His gaze swept across the room. "From this day forward, avoid pursuit combat. Hit once, then climb. Live to fight again." Sato said nothing. He simply nodded. The words echoed in his mind, the same as before, yet they felt heavier now, weighted by experience. Avoid pursuit combat. It was no longer a theoretical order from some distant manual. It was the thin line between life and death. That night, as darkness fell over the airfield, Sato sat alone beside his fighter. The metal skin of the Zero reflected the moonlight, and in its reflection he saw his own weary face. He thought of the Mustangs, their shimmering wings, their roaring dives, their power. They were not merely machines. They were symbols of a new kind of war, one defined by energy, altitude, and technology. He reached out and touched the cool metal of his aircraft. The Zero had carried him through countless battles, but he knew its time was fading. The sky now belonged to faster, stronger machines. Yet, even in defeat, he felt a quiet pride for his comrades, for his homeland, for the courage it took to face an enemy that seemed unstoppable. The next morning, as the sun rose once more over the Pacific, the airfield came alive again. Mechanics worked, pilots prepared, and engines roared. The war would go on, as wars always do. But somewhere deep inside, Sato understood that the world had shifted forever. The Mustang had changed the sky, and no amount of bravery could turn it back. He whispered to himself the words that had defined this new reality, words born not of surrender, but of survival. Avoid pursuit combat. Then, with quiet resolve, he climbed once more into his cockpit, ready to meet the dawn. The weeks that followed brought no peace to the skies above Japan. Each sunrise over the Pacific carried with it the low hum of approaching engines, the faint promise of battle, and the unshakable presence of silver wings gleaming in the distance. It was the late spring of 1945, and the air war had changed beyond recognition. Where once the Japanese had ruled the heavens with skill and agility, now they faced an enemy that dictated every engagement, the American Mustang. Its range, its speed, and its terrifying dive had reshaped the psychology of air combat. Every pilot in the Japanese air defense knew the truth. The era of the turning fight was over. In the aftermath of repeated defeats, Japanese command began to adapt. Gone were the days of predictable intercepts and valiant chases through open sky. Instead, they turned to strategy altitude traps, ambushes, and hit-and-run strikes. The pilots were ordered to disperse their aircraft, hiding them among trees or inside camouflaged revetments to avoid preemptive air raids. Night fighters were pre-positioned along the coastlines, and ground crews worked under cover of darkness to preserve what little remained of the Empire's air power. But even as these changes took root, one truth lingered like a storm cloud: the Americans held the advantage, and they knew it. Lieutenant Sato's squadron was summoned to a training field near Fukuoka. There, in a makeshift classroom of wooden tables and chalk maps, an instructor outlined the new tactics. "Altitude is your ally," he said, tapping the board with a pointer. "Hold the high ground, strike once, and disengage. Do not chase them into a dive. Conserve your energy." The pilots nodded, though their eyes betrayed exhaustion. They had heard these words before. Still, they followed orders. Over the next few weeks, they drilled tirelessly, holding altitude, practicing ambushes from above, breaking rapidly under cloud cover to escape pursuit. The exercises were intense, but the truth was unavoidable. Resources were scarce, fuel was rationed, and training time was limited. Each flight meant risk. Each sortie consumed precious fuel that could not easily be replaced. And while the Japanese struggled to sustain their operations, the Americans seemed boundless in their reach. The P-51 Mustangs, equipped with long-range drop tanks, could roam hundreds of miles beyond their bases. They patrolled over coastlines, rail lines, and industrial targets deep inside the home islands. Wherever they appeared, they forced the Japanese to scramble, spreading their already thin defenses across multiple fronts. What had once been the proud shield of the Empire had now become a patchwork of desperation. For Sato, these weeks felt like living in the shadow of inevitability. Every time his aircraft took off, he wondered if it would return. The familiar roar of his Zero's engine no longer filled him with confidence, but with apprehension. He had come to respect, even fear, the silver Mustangs. Their sound in the distance, that deep, distinct whine of the Merlin engine, was enough to set nerves on edge. Pilots spoke of them with grim reverence. Some described them as meteors, others as ghosts that appeared from the sun and vanished before a counterattack could even begin. One afternoon, the squadron was called into action. Enemy formation sighted over the southern coastline. Altitude, 18,000 feet. Sato and his wingman, Sergeant Ito, launched immediately. The airfield was hot and bright, the air thick with humidity. They climbed steadily, engines straining, the sea glimmering beneath them. As they reached altitude, Sato spotted flashes of sunlight far ahead, silver shapes against the blue. The Mustangs. The first pass was swift and brutal. 3 American fighters came screaming down from above, their guns spitting fire. The Japanese formation scattered instinctively. Sato rolled left, avoiding the first burst, then glanced over his shoulder just in time to see Ito diving to pursue one of the attackers. "Ito, break off!" Sato shouted into his microphone. "Don't follow!" But the young pilot, driven by instinct and courage, continued the chase. The Mustang ahead dove steeply, its drop tanks falling away as it accelerated. Ito followed, his Zero vibrating violently as the airspeed climbed. Within seconds, the control surfaces began to stiffen. The Mustang leveled out smoothly, while Ito's aircraft trembled uncontrollably. Then, without warning, it pitched downward, struck the sea, and vanished in a plume of white spray. Sato's breath caught in his throat. The radio filled with static. For a long moment he could not speak. He stared at the distant ocean, where only a patch of foam remained. "Ito, respond," he whispered. But there was no answer. Above, the Mustang climbed gracefully through the clouds, disappearing into the sun. In that instant, Sato understood. The message was not written in words, but in speed and power. The Mustang's dive was not simply a maneuver, it was a declaration of dominance. When Sato returned to base later that day, the mood was grim. The mechanics worked in silence, the wind carrying the faint scent of oil and sea salt. He walked across the tarmac, his flight suit streaked with sweat and soot, and sat beneath the wing of his aircraft. He replayed the encounter in his mind again and again, searching for something he could have done differently, but there was nothing. Ito had followed the old instinct, the pursuit, and it had cost him his life. That evening, during the debrief, the squadron commander spoke plainly. "You all saw what happened," he said, his voice low. "The Mustang controls the dive. Its energy is unmatched. From this day forward, you must not pursue. Strike when you can, break away when you must. Live to fight another day." The pilots nodded, their faces expressionless. The phrase echoed once more through the room: "Avoid pursuit combat." It no longer sounded like a tactical instruction. It sounded like an epitaph. On the other side of the conflict, the American pilots were making similar observations, though from a position of strength. They had begun to realize that the Mustang's greatest value was not only in its range or speed, but in its ability to control engagements entirely. They could choose when to attack, when to climb, and when to disengage. They held the initiative. Their doctrine, built on energy fighting, allowed them to dominate any encounter that relied on momentum. "We own the altitude," one pilot reportedly said after a mission. "They can't touch us unless we let them." By mid-year, the results were undeniable. Japanese squadrons flew fewer offensive sorties. Each engagement seemed to sap more than fuel it, drained morale. The Mustangs patrolled the skies above the home islands with impunity. They escorted bombers by day and hunted stragglers by dusk. Even when they were not visible, their threat lingered. Radar operators reported sightings, but often the Japanese fighters hesitated to engage. Fear had become a weapon as real as bullets or bombs. Sato flew less frequently as the summer approached, though each mission weighed heavier on his conscience. He had seen too many friends vanish in smoke or flame. The phrase that haunted the radios, "Avoid pursuit combat," now felt like a kind of prayer, a reminder that survival depended on restraint, not aggression. It was a bitter truth for men raised on the warrior's ideal of honor through battle. Yet, even as morale waned, discipline held. The remaining pilots adapted as best they could, striking when opportunity arose and withdrawing before the Mustangs could exploit their speed. One night, as rain drummed softly against the barracks roof, Sato wrote in his logbook. His handwriting trembled as he recorded the events of the day, 1 lost, no kills. Mustang dive uncontested. He paused, then added quietly beneath it, avoid pursuit, combat, not defeat, but understanding. He closed the book, staring at the flicker of the oil lamp. Outside, thunder rolled distantly, the sound of another storm approaching. By the time the calendar turned to July 1945, the transformation was complete. The Japanese air defense no longer sought to win the skies through glory or aggression. They sought merely to endure. The Mustangs continued to sweep across the Pacific horizon, their presence unchallenged, their dominance absolute. The once feared words of command had become doctrine, engraved into the very heart of Japan's fading air strategy. The old art of dogfighting, the turning duels that once defined aerial heroism, had died quietly amid clouds and contrails. In its place rose a new understanding. The future belonged to those who could control speed, range, and initiative. Sato knew this now, as did every pilot who still took to the air. And though the Empire's sun was setting, the lesson would endure a testament written not in ink, but in the sky itself. August of 1945 arrived not with fanfare, but with exhaustion. The Empire's airfields lay silent beneath the summer heat, their runways cracked and scarred from years of war. The skies above Japan, once a proud domain of swift, rising suns, now belonged to the enemy. The American Mustangs came in formation, their silver bodies glinting in the sunlight, escorting bombers and sweeping through the clouds with unchallenged supremacy. To the Japanese, they were no longer intruders, but inevitabilities. The air war had collapsed, and every pilot knew it. Lieutenant Sato sat alone beside his Zero, the once proud aircraft now dulled by weather and patched with metal plates of mismatched color. The smell of fuel and oil clung to the hangar air. He ran his hand across the chipped paint on the fuselage and felt the grooves beneath his fingers, reminders of past battles, of bullets that had missed by inches. The war had drained him, body and soul. Where once he had taken to the air with passion and faith, now he flew only because duty demanded it. His squadron, once 12 strong, had dwindled to 3 operational planes. The others lay scattered across the field, wrecked or stripped for parts. The radio crackled, an alert. Enemy aircraft approaching from the south. Sato rose slowly, his movements mechanical. He climbed into the cockpit, fastened his harness, and stared ahead through the scratched canopy. Outside, ground crews moved like shadows, waving him forward. The engine coughed, sputtered, then roared to life, the familiar vibration echoing through his bones. He taxied onto the runway, heart steady, mind quiet. The mission was simple: intercept and delay. In truth, it was little more than ritual, the motions of a war already lost. The Zero lifted gracefully into the morning air. The sky stretched wide and endless, pale blue above the haze. Sato climbed higher, the ocean glittering below like molten glass. The air thinned and grew cold, and with each passing second, the sound of the engine seemed to fade into memory. He remembered when this climb had felt like ascension, when the Zero had been the pride of Japan, unmatched in agility and grace. He had once believed, truly, that no aircraft could rival it. But then the Mustangs had come. He saw one for the first time the previous year, above the islands of Okinawa. It had dived out of the sun like a silver blade, its guns flashing, its engines screaming with a sound unlike anything he had heard before. The attack was swift and merciless. 2 of his comrades were gone before they even saw their attacker. After that, the radio message spread through every unit, calm, clipped, and resigned: avoid pursuit combat. It became a phrase every pilot repeated, not out of strategy, but out of survival. Now, a year later, Sato carried that phrase like an echo in his mind. Avoid pursuit combat. It had defined the twilight of his career. He no longer chased the enemy. He no longer fought for dominance. He fought simply to endure. As his aircraft climbed through the last layers of cloud, the horizon widened. In the far distance, he saw them tiny specks against the sky, moving with perfect formation. The Mustangs. He adjusted his throttle slightly, watching them through narrowed eyes. There was no hatred left, only respect and a deep, quiet sorrow. He knew what would happen next. The Mustangs would descend, engines howling, their guns cutting through the air like lightning. He would evade, perhaps fire a few bursts, then retreat under the cover of cloud. The cycle had repeated countless times, but today felt different. Today, he sensed an ending. As the enemy formation drew closer, Sato banked his Zero toward the sunlight. He climbed higher, the wings trembling as the altitude increased. Then, for a brief and reckless moment, he leveled off and dived through the thin clouds, his aircraft slicing the air with a sound like tearing silk. He did not aim at the Mustangs. He aimed at memory. The clouds parted, revealing the ocean below, blue, immense, and eternal. For a fleeting instant, he imagined his youth again, when flight meant freedom, not defeat. He leveled off at low altitude, the waves rushing beneath him. The sunlight shimmered on the water, and he could almost see the reflection of his aircraft trailing across the sea like a ghost. He fired a short burst into the empty air, not at an enemy, but at the sky itself, a farewell salute to everything that had defined his life. Then he turned back toward the coast. The mission was over before it had begun. As he approached the airfield, the radio remained silent. The other pilots had not followed. He landed gently, the wheels touching down with a sigh. The engine sputtered once, then fell quiet. For a moment, he simply sat there, his hands resting on the controls. The hangar stood ahead, its roof warped by years of sun and shrapnel. He could see the mechanics waiting by the entrance, their faces expressionless. Slowly, he unfastened his harness, removed his helmet, and climbed out. The air outside was warm and heavy. Cicadas buzzed in the distance. He looked up the sky, once alive with the sound of engines, was empty now. Only the faint contrails of the Mustangs remained, fading like chalk lines drawn across the heavens. Sato placed his helmet on the wing and exhaled. The war was ending. Everyone could feel it in the quiet tone of the officers, in the rationed fuel drums, in the sudden absence of urgency. He walked toward the hangar, each step echoing softly on the concrete. Inside, the walls were lined with tools, spare parts, and the remnants of once proud machines. He glanced at the markings on his aircraft, the red sun still bright against the worn metal, and wondered what they would mean in the years to come. Would children one day look at it and feel pride or sorrow? Would they remember the pilots who fought, or only the defeat that followed? Beyond the airfield, he could see smoke rising from a distant city. Rumors had spread among the troops terrible stories of new weapons unleashed by the Americans, of entire cities reduced to ashes in an instant. He did not know if they were true, but he sensed that something irreversible had happened. The war's end was no longer a matter of strategy or bravery. It was a matter of time. Far away, in Washington and London, men in suits were already speaking of victory and reconstruction. Reports praised the Mustang as the aircraft that had turned the tide, the long-range escort that had carried bombers deep into enemy territory and brought them home again. To the Allies, it was a symbol of innovation and triumph. To Sato, it was a symbol of change, the machine that had ended one era and begun another. He stepped outside the hangar once more, squinting against the setting sun. The light bathed the airfield in gold, soft and melancholy. He could hear the faint murmur of voices from the barracks, the clatter of tools, the quiet rhythm of life continuing even as the empire crumbled. He thought of the friends he had lost: Ito, Tanaka, and so many others whose names would fade into the wind. He thought of the sky that had once felt limitless and now seemed impossibly distant. He walked slowly toward the horizon, his boots stirring the dust. The sun hung low, casting long shadows across the field. For the first time in years, he felt no fear, no anger, only acceptance. The war had taken much from him, but it had given him a strange kind of wisdom. He had learned that courage was not found in pursuit, but in endurance, that even defeat could carry dignity. As the last light touched the wings of his old aircraft, Sato paused and looked back. The Zero stood silently, a relic of another time. He raised a hand in quiet salute to his comrades, to his enemies, to the endless sky that had witnessed it all. Then he turned away, walking into the fading glow. The air was still, the world suspended between destruction and peace. He did not know what the future would bring, only that he had survived to see it. And as he disappeared into the sunset, the message that had once echoed through his radio returned to him one final time, softer now, almost like a whisper carried by the wind. Avoid pursuit combat. The words no longer spoke of fear or retreat. They spoke of wisdom, of change, of the sky itself learning to rest after years of fire. The war was ending. The sky had changed. The pilot had lived. Years later, under a calm blue sky, an aging Sato stands among a crowd at an air show. Before him, a restored P-51. Mustang gleams like liquid silver in the sunlight. Its Merlin engine roars, smooth and confident, as it climbs and rolls through the open air. The crowd cheers, children wave flags, and Sato feels a deep ache of memory. He watches the aircraft dive, the same terrifying speed he once feared, now transformed into beauty. In his mind, the radio words return, "Avoid pursuit combat." They echo not as warning, but as wisdom. He understands now. That phrase had never meant surrender. It had marked the turning of an age. The Mustang had rewritten the rules of the sky: speed over spin, energy over elegance. The Zero belonged to a past that prized grace, the Mustang to a future that demanded power. Sato straightens, eyes moist, and offers a silent salute to all who once flew, friend and foe alike. The engines fade, replaced by gentle wind. Above, the sky stretches vast and eternal, unchanged yet forever different. And as the sound of the Mustang dissolves into the distance, Sato whispers softly, "Avoid pursuit combat." Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.